This is my Sony a6400 filmmaking rig. Everything that I need to create beautiful looking videos with a very reasonable price tag. Let's break it down and build it back up together, going through each component. Starting with the camera, the Sony a6400. I've already made a video entirely dedicated to this camera, which I'll link in the description if you want to check that out. But this is a very solid camera and it's cheap. You can easily pick up an a6400 for under $1,000. I'm actually super surprised how nice the footage is that comes out of this little camera. Being a budget and an older camera, you are missing out on some key things that some more expensive cameras will have. Like for instance, you can only shoot in 4K 24. So if you want to shoot slow motion, it would be in 1080p. The autofocus isn't nearly as good as some of the more expensive and some of the newer cameras, but as you'll see in a minute, I've built this rig out to be a cinema rig, meaning using a cinema lens, which is fully manual anyway, so the autofocus isn't really that big of a concern. That being said, you can easily upgrade this rig by swapping out the camera for something like an FX30 or an a6700. It'll just cost you some more money. Getting to the lens that I've paired this camera with, this is the Sony Nightwalker 24mm t1.2 lens. Sony released these lenses about a year ago, and there was a lot of hype around these lenses when they first came out, and I can now see why. I'm new to cinema lenses, so admittedly I don't have a lot to compare them to, but in terms of absolute image quality, this lens produces really beautiful footage. Clearly softer and more filmic looking than a photo lens, which was the goal in picking up a cinema lens. I even go so far as to put a mist filter on this lens to make the footage look even more cinematic and dreamy, as I quite like that look for my videos. This lens is really cheap, coming in at just $326 Canadian on AliExpress. You'd be hard pressed to find many lenses, photo or cinema in this price range, so the fact that you can pick up a lens that looks this good at this price point is pretty awesome. I also quite like this particular focal length. Being an APS-C camera, a 24mm lens basically equates to a 35mm on full frame, which just so happens to be my favorite focal length on a full frame camera. If this focal length isn't your thing, the Nightwalker lenses also come in a 35, a 55, and a 75. And you could even save some money by buying these lenses as a kit if you have some extra money to spend. Now, moving on to the cage and the rigging out of this camera. You don't necessarily have to rig this out. I mean, you could just run and gun and shoot with it as is, but I think it functions a little better as a rig for a couple reasons. For one, the LCD screen on the camera just isn't big enough when you're pulling manual focus with a lens like this. It's hard to see when you're in focus without an external monitor and some of the features that come with it. The camera or the lens don't have stabilization as well, and so rigging out the camera will add some heft to it and make it a little more sturdy and a little more stable when you're shooting with it. There's a ton of different cages that you can buy. This is a $50 small rig cage. It has one 1/4-20 screw on the bottom and then another little screw that goes into the little hole on the side of the camera where you would normally attach a camera strap. I have a small rig top handle mounted to the top of the cage. Again, there are a bunch of different top handles and ways that you can mount them to the top of the cage. This one came with a little NATO rail, which allows you to mount the rail to the cage, and then you can quickly slide the handle on and off, which is pretty handy if you're swapping the top handle between rigs, or if you want the ability to quickly take it on and off. There's another little small rig piece which screws onto the RE locating pins on the top handle, which then connects to my external monitor, and this in my opinion is the cleanest way to mount the external monitor to make it as low profile as possible. The external monitor that I'm using is the OC Littlemon 5, and while it's not the cheapest monitor you can buy, it's a good middle ground where you can still get a lot of really great features without being crazy expensive like the small HD or the Atomos monitors. You can load LUTs onto it, show focus peaking and false colors, which is especially handy when shooting with a manual lens. You can change aspect ratios, overlay grids, and it's touchscreen, which I really like. Some of the cheaper monitors are not touchscreen, and for a little bit of extra money, if you have the budget, I think that it's worth it to get a monitor that's touchscreen. There are so many other little pieces and accessories that you can add to the rig depending on what your needs are. But I would say this is kind of bare bones what you need to get up and running. Using just this setup, you can get some really clean footage. One really nice addition to the rig, if you have the budget for it, is a means to power it. I recently picked up this V-mount battery which can power both the monitor and the camera itself. Again, it's not necessary, but it's nice to not have to change out batteries every 30 minutes because, as you'll come to find out, these little batteries die pretty quickly when you're continuously recording 4K video. And this V-mount battery lasts quite a while. If you do add a V-mount battery like this though, it means you need to add a base plate rails, and a V-mount to mount the battery to, which obviously adds a little more additional cost to the build, but in my opinion is well worth it for not only the power obviously, but for the added stability to the rig you get by making it bigger and heavier. Another item that I've added to the rig is a follow focus wheel. This just makes it a bit easier to pull focus in my opinion, and it doesn't require you to have to be fiddling with the lens and bumping it, making your footage a little bit smoother. I've also added a side handle here to give a little more stability when I'm shooting handheld. If you're also recording audio, you'll obviously need to add a mic to this setup. There's a ton of options out there which I'm not going to get into because that could be another video in its entirety, but the mic that I've been using quite a bit is the Rode VideoMic NTG, which is definitely not the cheapest mic, but I think it sounds pretty good. In fact, it's what you're hearing right now. So there you have it, base rig and then some additional options depending on your budget. Like I said, there's so many ways that you can customize and add to this rig depending on what your needs are, but I think this is a pretty good little rig for what I'm using it for. Anyway, I hope this was helpful. If it was and you want to keep seeing stuff like this, then be sure to subscribe so that you don't miss my next video. I'll see you guys in the next one.